On October 24th, 2018, Lonely Planet ranked Sri Lanka the best country in the world to visit in 2019. 2 days later, on October 26th, the Sri Lankan executive president at that time attempted to appoint the former president and his political rival in the previous election of 2015 as his prime minister, thus ousting the prime minister that was serving. When the executive president attempted to dissolve parliament and call for elections, citizens gathered every evening at Independence Square in Colombo, calling the coup unconstitutional. A choreographer ventured into the gathering. Their body and face fully covered, they attempted to hide the identifications that are politically deployed to divide common people: class, ethnicity, and gender. Obscuring their voice, their hands and feet, and their body, they alternated between 3 different masks that loosely represented the 3 men at the crux of the crisis: the president, former president, and prime minister. Standing with 2 bunches of bananas and next to a sign from the protests that read "Horn for Democracy," the choreographer held another sign that corrected the official name of the state, Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, to the moniker Banana Republic of Sri Lanka. Banana Republic did not simply imply political instability of a country, the exploitation of one country by other governments, or the stratification of classes, but also linked personally to local practices with the fruit. Over the course of the evening, the choreographer would engage in various conversations with those that approached, learning of financial difficulties, the feelings of hopelessness, and the exhaustion with the elite in power. The desire of the choreographer to make their personal identity absent to protest the potential coup in October 2018 is significant to this discussion of performance in Sri Lanka. It rejects the ways in which identity has been placed on and constructed through dance for the sake of nation. It speaks to how dancers respond to the conditions of their time. It speaks to dance as protest. I will come back to this performance and protest later in the talk. My name is Ahalya Satkunaratnam, and I'm speaking to you from Vancouver, Canada, the unceded and occupied lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I was born in Malaysia and grew up in Canada and the United States. I've been watching the series from Kälam on migration and identity, and I intend to build on several ideas shared thus far. The issues in these preceding talks, classification, colonialism, and migration, are all woven into my talk today on dance, particularly Natyam and its practice in Colombo and among the diaspora. My book, Moving Bodies, Navigating Conflict, is an examination of the ways in which Bharatanatyam dance practice in Colombo embodies war. Dance has long operated as a symbol of ethnic identity and a medium of enculturation through education and practice. It is a marker of identity made visible, embodied, performed, and circulated. Images of dancers adorn billboards, stamps, and currency. Yet dancers employ dance to negotiate ethnicity, transgress gender, query or affirm the nation, and survive war every day. Practitioners and choreographers employ performance to assert their own representations during the period of war, forging subversive strategies to make visible discussions of identity and experiences silenced by structures of domination, whether surveillance, militarization, or nationalism. Today, I will discuss the origins of Bharatanatyam in Colombo that were learned through personal stories and historical research that are part of my book. And I will also discuss briefly dance in the diaspora and my own dance work in the US and in Canada. As Sri Lankan Tamils in the homeland and in the diaspora, our obsession has been one of origins. Most people across the many diasporas share this desire for anchoring because of the power in belonging. Many of us can look to local politics around borders, those in detention, visas, migrants, and war to know intimately why belonging matters. Bharatanatyam dance is a global form and a popular form in Sri Lanka, South Asia, and across the South Asian diaspora. Some may view Bharatanatyam simply as an Indian dance form that migrated to the island nation. It is, in part, a reconstructed and revived Indian national dance produced from the temple dance tradition of the Devadasis, the matriarchal community of temple performing artists. Amit Srinivasan and Avanti Maduri locate the Devadasi dancing body in transformations taking place in the later years of the British Raj, rising Indian nationalism, and the emergence of the post-colonial Indian state. Devadasi's practices were outlawed to appease Victorian sensibilities. Their outlawing also illuminated the financial shifts created by European colonization. It also demonstrated the values dominant in Indian nationalism, which was Orientalist in its desire for the pre-colonial and ancient, and had embraced European ideas of the spiritual. The Devadasi dance of Sadir was reformed to be acceptable for upper class and upper caste women, particularly by the practices of Rukmini Devi Arundale, the founder of Kalakshetra. In addition, colonial modernity, as Avanti Maduri writes, introduced British stagecraft and recostumed, restaged, and theatricalized the form in the manner of Isadora Duncan, who's an American dancer who became very famous in Europe and who thought of dance as a sacred art and a high art form. Yet according to Davesh Sonaji, a historian, based I think now in the US, long before the anti-Devadasi debates began in South India, dance by Devadasis in temples was publicly condemned in Sri Lanka in the context of a larger Saiva religious reform movement spearheaded by Arumugha Navalar. A Buddhist reform movement was similarly spearheaded by Dharmapala too in Sri Lanka. These reform movements elevated the importance of the written text over local ritual and religious practice. Sonaji establishes that temple dancers based in Colombo defended their practices by marking their bodies and practices as ancient and pre-colonial, ancient and divine. In both Buddhist and Hindu social reform or revival movements, the role of lay women was very important to enacting social reform. The Ceylon Tamil Women's Union, founded in 1909, and Saiva Mangayar Kalaham, founded in 1930, were organizations established in Colombo to counter the effects of colonialism and what they identified as cultural miscegenation. They would emerge as the primary sites for the learning of Bharatanatyam dance in Colombo. Both institutions also were elite in their audience and membership. Miscegenation and transnational influence were denied, even though the discourse of social reform, as deployed by these Tamil and women's organizations, and the practice and lives of Devadasis in Colombo stretched beyond borders and were shaped by the colonial project. In search of origins, when I started my research into dance, I learned through personal archives that young girls of class and caste status of all faiths and ethnic backgrounds took to the dance practice in these early years of the form in Colombo. One informant and early practitioner remembers a sense of ethnic plurality in the dance form. She remembers the first dancer of Bharatanatyam in Colombo as a young Sinhala girl. I met this first dancer's daughter, and she recalled the respectability of Bharatanatyam through her learning of Kalakshetra Bharatanatyam and spoke little of ethnic difference with me. By November 1950, dance had become such a popular form for Sri Lanka that a national platform was created through the All Ceylon Dance Festival. Bharatanatyam was featured in the festival, included under the category of Oriental dance. Several of the Indian classical dance practices were included under this term Oriental: Bharatanatyam, Manipuri, Kathak, and Kathakali. The categories of Oriental and Western were open to women, whereas the third category, Kandyan, featured only men. Subsequent to the 1950 All Ceylon Dance Festival, the national government's Department of Education allocated 50,000 rupees to the advancement of indigenous dancing, and Bharatanatyam was included under this term. Yet, in this usage, the term indigenous didn't have the caste association that would often have been rejected in upper caste and class Tamil culture, which was the dominant culture of Tamil Bharatanatyam practice. It instead gave a sense of belonging and home that was clearly becoming more difficult to possess. The label of Indian and Tamil were ascribed onto Bharatanatyam with the rise of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism and with the state's creation of a new national dance by the mid-1950s, Kandyan dance. Kandyan dance was a transformation of a male drummer practice into a feminized form welcoming to women of status and created in response to the popularity of Bharatanatyam among elite women across ethnicity in Sri Lanka. It was a political creation, as was Bharatanatyam, much in response to the forces of opposition, here colonialism and the domination of non-Sinhala culture. As Kandyan dance became the national dance form, some early dance patrons in the Colombo Tamil community shared their desires to identify Bharatanatyam as a national dance form which would embrace Tamils within the nation. The All Ceylon Dance Festival illuminates a hybridity of Sri Lanka through the categories of the festival: Western, Oriental, Kandyan, where multiple cultural aspects were included that differ from the popular way in which Sri Lanka is read internally and externally. The transnational, exemplified in the movement between and association with India, situates a political condition of Sri Lanka. Like at some point in my ethnographic research, I was told by a Kandyan dancer to go to India to explore Bharatanatyam and not to consider it as a research subject within Sri Lanka. Bharatanatyam is meaningful too through these political discourses. It is an experience that speaks to a shifting political condition. So what did I learn? What did I see? What did I dance? While tradition has been utilized by the state and its nationalisms, in the arts, tradition, although widely understood as intentionally constructed, is also considered repetitive and lacking innovation, a failure in artistry that prizes singular and innovative creation. This notion of uniqueness plagues the examination of Sri Lanka within dance studies. Often I am asked, what exactly is different about Bharatanatyam practice in Sri Lanka in comparison to the practice in India? This question not only undoes the constructed nature of modern post-colonial forms bound to nation states, but also views traditional performance as an unintelligent repetition and replication. As I observed, practice and performed through my fieldwork during in what would become the final years of the war from 2006 to 2008, I learned how choreographers in Colombo were using the familiar repertoire of Bharatanatyam, the tradition, to address the context of war, employing well-circulated materials such as the Mahabharata to address the violence of war, of divided families, of women's conditions. I would also encounter choreographers that would suggest a meaning or significance to their dance and choreography during the war in 2007 that would by 2012 state that such meanings or significances were incorrect, especially those meanings and significances that were in connection to the war experience. I saw multi-ethnic and religious companies of Bharatanatyam trained dancers sidelined as too Tamil. Producers of large-scale performances would want Bharatanatyam dance to become more modern, attaching itself to Hollywood and Bollywood styles. Ironically, Hollywood and Bollywood styles are very much influenced by Bharatanatyam practice as well. So I saw ethnic divisions also between dance forms, and I would see Bharatanatyam dancers distance themselves from popular forms. I saw Bharatanatyam dance teachers fear breaking the expectations and the limits of Bharatanatyam for fear of not being respected as dance teachers any longer within the community. I also saw Bharatanatyam dancers demoralized as they innovated within a practice, but their innovation was not decipherable to an untrained eye that only saw the dance as a static style. I saw dance practice as an uneven economic terrain, where dancers were favored on their relationship to Colombo, to the Sinhala language, because of their ethnicity, and that the teaching of dance in the aesthetic curriculum in the schools was not fully integrated, meaning Bharatanatyam was taught in both Sinhala and Tamil medium schools, but Kandyan dance was not provided as in Tamil medium schools. Janet O'Shea's substantive exploration of Bharatanatyam as a global form shows that contemporary meanings assigned to the dance are tied strongly to the form's revival years, which began my talk when I was speaking of origins. So the contemporary meanings assigned to the dance are tied strongly to those origin years, and its position within colonial, anti-colonial, and Indian nationalist movements. But she also notes the flexibility of the form in connoting a meaning and intention of its contemporary practitioners. With Sri Lanka, many are interested in how the form was used to support the separatist struggle through the Tiger's investment in cultural production. Such works are highlighted in O'Shea's chapter From Temple to Battlefield. She considers this representation as part of a revolutionary strategy through its support of the separatist movement. She also offers two other examples of Bharatanatyam to be read as intersecting with war, yet differing in its representation of what is done with dance, a neutrality that is apolitical and a practice that affords reconciliation between groups made opposed through nationalism. My book speaks of several different choreographies. My book, Moving Bodies Navigating Conflict, does not limit politicization to particular expressions of art tied to the separatist struggle or electoral politics. It does explore many modes of dance practice that may often be read as neutral from the recognized politics of war. I am invested in reading how politics shapes what is performed. Policy is an important way for us to understand how difference and discrimination become greater culture. Money or resources that are produced and distributed through policy is also significant. I look to the work of anti-racists and those that are fighting against domination and discrimination to address these issues as well. In my own work, Bharatanatyam has been a tool of speaking and enacting a type of radical thinking, to question the decisions of the state, to oppose war, to interrogate violence and discrimination. I share today a brief excerpt of my piece, Consequential, that I was able to perform in Colombo in 2013. Consequential was choreographed to recognize the 10th anniversary of September 11th, 2001, and the global war on terror. It was also a tribute to Lasantha Wickrematunge, editor of the Sunday Leader, who was assassinated on 8th of January 2009 before his last and final editorial was published on January 11th, which addressed his impending death. The piece used the storytelling elements of the dance and worked with turning the same hand gesture or mudra in opposing ways. Opposition and reversal were in constant play to evoke continuous cycles of oppression and war. The audience had to participate in the performance as I danced through them, leaving them behind with the consequences of my movement with a red ribbon that tied and grouped them. In the diaspora, Bharatanatyam is used as a form of enculturation. Ironically, it maintains a sense of culture from the homeland and is popular also because of the experience of migration and the journey of colonization, or being part of a settler colonial state, such as Canada and the United States. White-centered marketplaces for the arts and culture through state programs or commercialism also continue to demand that brown and black bodies perform what is expected to maintain tradition. They often can't see brown bodies as agentive, creative, and innovative in the arts. White supremacy prevails in several dance forums and stages in North America and determines who is of value from year to year. It often decides how bodies can present themselves. In many ways, whiteness dictates the privileges of others. Whether today it is important for audiences to see Indigenous performers, Black performers, or Asian and Latinx performers, race then becomes a trend that continues to place whiteness in control and at the center. The irony, however, is that many of these performance styles outside of Europe were the forms that contributed to the creation of modern dance in Europe and North America. These non-European forms often were used for white artists to create new moves, new choreographies, new repertoire. The influence of South Asian dance on modern dance is discussed in Priya Srinivasan's Sweating Saris. Modern dance and modern dancers abstracted non-European movements, placing them outside of the identity and context in which they were performed, and presented these moves that they've from these non-European contexts as abstract universal dance on white bodies. These issues of influence can also be understood in recent uprisings in support of Black Lives Matter, where the influence of Black creativity and knowledge becomes appropriated for capital, while there is great violence on Black bodies. In modern dance, identity is undone often through abstraction. At the beginning of my talk, I discussed a choreographer who hid their identity for the protests at Independence Square in Colombo. In understanding dance, it is important to note the very different context of these abstractions. One, the white body becoming universal through taking on these moves from forms that are outside of Europe and removing the context of those forms and practices and movements. The choreographer in Colombo, however, is opposing the universal of ethnic division and state nationalism in Sri Lanka. So these are kind of two different ways of interpreting abstraction that I think are important and come from thinking critically about the context in which performance happens. I decided most recently in the last 2 weeks to address the uprisings against police brutality through a Natyam style choreography. I asked a dear Sri Lankan friend, poet, and scholar, Vivi Marie Vanderpoorten, to see if she had any pieces that resonated with the time that we're in today. She shared with me her poem, Madness, about a boy who was experiencing a mental health issue, who was killed by Sri Lankan police soon after the war while a crowd watched. For me, the poem touches on the ease with which violence that is not only endemic in Sri Lankan society, that has witnessed the frequency of violence because of war, but also endemic in so many of us who nullify the gravity of daily loss.
Wonder was horror-edged, and pity was guilt-edged. Flotsam on our conscience as we watched the boy thrown into a senseless sea swirling with violence, and a shocking anger beat him to death and forced him to drown. We who had watched worse and said nothing gazed in silence, and a mobile phone video recorded footage of folly. That moment of hideous history prevailed to bear witness to a country whose war was just over, to a people now at peace. The waters whirl, and the foam is still froth white. The sun glistens still on the golden sand, but the boy we call mad is retreating into the ocean, still trying to hold off the blows with batons and sticks, the last vestiges of his strength devoured by hatred and waves, and our humanity strangles itself on the shore.